from your perspective, what can large organizations learn from startups and vice versa about really driving, real innovation in healthcare?
It is very difficult to truly innovate inside a big company. It's hard to get people to change and think differently. But I remember one time sitting with Joe Costello and he said, I can try to spawn 10 different innovations inside our company and one of them will be successful. Or I can let the market entrepreneurs out there design great new products.
What's your advice for entrepreneurs who feel discouraged by all of this, by the approvals, delays, setbacks, everything that goes into it?
You got to start with.
Welcome to the K in Clarity podcast. I'm your host, Mezue. During this episode, we're joined by Jim Behrens, CEO of FoodKey. Jim Behrens began his story as a paramedic before pursuing a PhD, where his early work contributed to automated external defibrillators. Today, he's focused on diabetes and metabolic health, making nutrition guidance simple, affordable, and culturally intelligent. Drawing from decades of clinical, academic, and entrepreneurial experience, Jim helps translate complex science into everyday decisions that empower people to improve their metabolic health sustainably. Now, if this is your first time tuning in, here's the gist. Healthcare is buzzing with innovations, but there's a lot of noise and misconceptions out there. That's where we come in. Because of my experience in the healthcare ecosystem, I've gained a unique vantage point into the industry's inner workings. This podcast brings you the conversations that usually stay behind closed doors, the real challenges, innovative solutions, and game-changing insights reshaping healthcare as we know it. On this podcast, you'll hear firsthand from the founders, executives, and operators who are building and reshaping U.S. healthcare, diving into what it actually takes to build, scale, and transform a system this complex, the hurdles they've overcome, the strategies driving their success, and the personal challenges that come with it. So whether you're an entrepreneur, a medical professional, or just someone passionate about the future of health, this podcast is your backstage pass to the minds shaping the industry. Now let's have Jim tell us a little bit about themselves. Hello, Jim, and welcome to the K in Clarity podcast. For the people listening, can you give a brief overview of who you are and what it is you do?
Sure. Yeah. My name is Jim Behrens. I'm currently the CEO of my next startup, if you will, and the product is called FoodKey. I've been doing this really largely for 40 years, starting companies. I started out in electrical engineering, computer science, and I'm from Colorado. And in order to pay for my schooling, I had to get a job. So I ended up getting a job as a paramedic. And I would work nights and weekends while I went to school. And so I was a paramedic for like 7 years and spent 8 hours of every shift in the emergency rooms. And so switched out of electrical engineering and over to chemistry, where I got my degree and then started a PhD in cardiovascular physiology. But the first product that I was working on was an automatic external defibrillator, and because we'd use those as paramedics and saw the need, because unless you were full-blown paramedic and had telemetry, they weren't going to let you defibrillate at that time. And so I could clearly see that the computer could make that decision as good as a physician could. And now we've proven probably better in many cases, but that's a different story. So I left the PhD program and built the first company, which was the first AEDs, automatic external defibrillators. Did that for like 5 years, sold it to a major medical company, and learned a lot of lessons there. I think we'll probably touch on some of those as we get into other questions. But then I joined a big company because in the course of running that first one, being a naive entrepreneur for the first time, I had no clue about sales and distribution and marketing and all the things that go along with running a business. And so I looked around and said, who's in software like where I want to be, and who's big enough that can teach me all those things. So at that time I joined Cadence Design Systems, actually talked my way into it. Went to the CEO, said, I've never sold before, but let me start at sales and then work my way up. And he sort of laughed at me. And I said, I'll do it for free if you need to for a few months. And then you can fire me if you don't like my performance. And he goes, I like your moxie. I'll hire you anyway, because I can fire you along the way if you don't do a good job anyway. So I was there for 9 years on multiple different groups, starting their consulting business, ran multiple divisions, worldwide operations, and a bunch of other things. So it accomplished exactly what I wanted, but it also told me that I don't want to work at a big company. So left there, started an incubator, and we jumped out a bunch of products from there. And we'll probably talk about some of those with some of your questions. And so I've been all over the space, from healthcare to multi-point video to large software testing to multimedia. Before Apple had lots of patents on that we spent some time going after Apple, but saw that was going to be the sport of kings, and I'll never live long enough to collect. So we dropped that, went off and built other products. So then spent the largest stint for about the last 20 years doing everything from remote patient monitoring for cancer care to the behavioral health remote monitoring of patients to precision medicine in cancer, and then came around to where we are currently, which is in nutrition and how it's associated with chronic conditions, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and dozens of others, including 13 cancers that are all caused by what we eat in our lifestyle. And so we're producing products that we hope are going to make that, at least for some part of the population, a non-issue. They will live long and healthy lives without developing any of those conditions. So that's where I am, and multiple exits, IPOs, and other things along the way. I love building things, and so I'll keep building things until they tell me I'm no longer vital enough to do that.
Well, thank you, Jim. That's quite lovely. And as you might know, we typically like to do an icebreaker question, right? And so going into what you mentioned, if you could instantly change, one misconception about nutrition and chronic disease for every patient and physician, what would it be and why?
Wow, so that's a $1 million question, which is we have huge control over our disease profile well into the 90s. Most of the conditions that you see that cause people to be incapacitated and been treating for diseases, like the ones I mentioned, diabetes, et cetera, are 80 to 90% plus caused by our lifestyle. And so if people understood that you don't have to go to extremes to both prevent and in many cases reverse those conditions by changes to your lifestyle, and they're not deprivation changes, right? So restricting calories, eating a very strict diet, being extreme in your workouts, none of those are required. In fact, none of those work long-term. And it's been shown for the last 40 years that those don't work. So you got to do something that's much simpler and it requires no effort up front and no cost and is easy to use for people in order to start affecting that. And that's what we're doing.
As you mentioned in your intro, you spent your career as an entrepreneur and an innovator, from developing the first AEDs to launching remote monitoring and nutrition apps. And so what drives your passion for building health technology? And obviously, how did you get into this space?
Well, so I think, it goes all the way back to when I was probably 10 years old. My father ran he had his own business, which was building store fixtures. So like inside Nordstrom's, the display cases and remodeling the departments and all that kind of stuff. So he had a huge, like 100,000 square foot shop with all these big equipment and whatever. And my favorite thing at that age was he would take me over there while he did work on like Saturday, and I would go through and clean out the place. So I would pick up all the pieces that were thrown off while they were building stuff and sawdust and whatever, and I'd sweep and clean the whole place and load those on a truck. And I'd do it as fast as I could because then I got to go build stuff. And so I had this amazing workshop of materials and for that metal and wood and plastics and everything else that I could go build. And, it's amazing because my father would just let me run around and do that stuff back there while he was in his office. And I still have all 10 of my fingers, and I can't believe that I did after all that. So anyway, I started and loved to build stuff, from a very early age. And then I got the real bug when I was a paramedic, because as I was doing the things you did during each of those shifts, responding outside, we covered about 2,200 square miles. I was in Fort Collins, Colorado. So we had canyons and mountains and downtowns and whatever. And there were so many things that seemed suboptimal that we would do and use both in the emergency room and outside of it, that I started building things. things, right? So design some universal blood pressure cuffs, because today, you still have to use 5 different size cuffs depending on the size of your arm, from an infant to an adult, and then built some backboards that were curved and made it easier to extract people from cars. And that led to a bunch of different devices, which was the genesis of the automatic external defibrillator. So as I got through the university, and with my EE and CS background as well as chemistry and medicine, it's all the ideas came together that this was possible to use microprocessors to do that kind of intelligence. So now, I'm focused on helping people in the broadest way I possibly can. And, right now, fixing this healthcare problem that's a $1 trillion problem and is decades worth of infirmity for people. You may or may not know this, that the average adult will have only one healthy birthday after they're 65 years old. And many of them will have 2 or 3 or 4 chronic conditions by then, all of which are preventable, with the right tools. So we're focusing on, a really big problem for the world and the nation. But I should mention that this part of the health journey that we're on right now with nutrition and exercise and that was caused because I have a daughter, an older daughter. I was standing on the side of a soccer field where she had one of my grandsons out there, and she said, feel my belly. And as I touched her belly, I said, wow, it's really hard. And she goes, yeah, and I'm not pregnant. And so what pursued after that was 2 years worth of all kinds of investigations and lab tests and registries and transplant lists. She had what's called MASH now. They keep changing the name, but now it's metabolic associated steatohepatitis, which is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And she needed a transplant by the time the symptoms show up. By the way, there's 18 million others in the U.S., adults running around asymptomatic with the same problem, and they'll end up by the time they know it, they'll end up needing a transplant, same way. But as I researched what was going on, that's when the tuning fork hit my head and said, oh my gosh, this is all caused by poor nutrition, too many calories, and lack of exercise. And you could sum up all her condition and all these others back to that same problem. And we said, oh my gosh, it's curable, it's preventable. Why aren't we doing anything about it that is useful and simple enough that it can be applied inexpensively across the population? Because there are some solutions, and we'll probably talk about that with some of your questions. But they're expensive, require lots of time, the mental cognitive load every day, planning your food, all those things, those won't work. So all of those were the genesis of, how I've been building stuff and doing things for my whole life. I look for a problem and then look to apply broad technology to solve it, and love building things. And by the way, the 6 or 7 you see on my LinkedIn are only a third of the ones that we started, and decided that for money or technology or how long it will take to get into the market, they weren't worth it, and those were put on the shelf. So the ones you can see and read about me are all only ones that were successful, not the ones that we threw away early on.
Well, to get more granular, right, your work spans from everything from paramedicine to cardiovascular research, med devices, behavioral health, cancer therapy, and now nutrition AI. And so what have you learned about the hardest part of translating, scientific insight actually into successful and scalable products?
The number one problem in the medical space, is overcoming the insurance managed healthcare system, right? It's as simple as that, right? That healthcare system, the insurance part of that, runs the assembly line, and, the physicians are on. You go to see your personal physician, you got 10 minutes with them. Their back is, if you're lucky, and not turned completely to you as they're recording the notes into their computer and that. And, they've got to find everything they can to bill, to get reimbursed for, and get out of there in their 10 minutes and move on. And, I don't blame them. If you gave them their choice, they would love to sit there and solve the problems and spend more time with you, but they can't. And so, specific for like our example, do your physicians know that it's nutrition and exercise and calories? Kind of. So as you're leaving, they say, eat more fruits and vegetables and lose some weight, right? Doesn't change your behavior. at all. They don't have time to change your behavior. They don't have any tools they can give you to help change your behavior. And the insurance company isn't that worried about cost, because if costs go up and new therapies come in that are expensive, they'll just raise the rates and they'll charge more and they make more money. So the system is set up with incentives that are not built in for the physicians and or the insurance company to fix these problems, which is why, a lot of our latest endeavors are with entry vehicles to the market that do not require us to go through regulatory approvals. And I think we'll probably talk more about that.
Yeah. I know, as you just mentioned, FDA regulation shaped your early journey, developing AEDs. And so how did moving from hardware and regulated devices to digital health and software really change your approach to design, risk, right? And how you actually go to market?
Well, so what I can tell you is that the quickest way to get a PhD in any type of market is to try to do a startup company in that market. You will learn things that you can't learn in school and you can't learn anywhere, and it's shifting so fast all the time and accelerating. That you will learn lots of stuff. So my first lessons with the AED were, oh my gosh, don't pick a significant risk device that requires the highest degree of FDA approval. Right? We spent 5 years and 3 clinical trials, and at that time, lots of money. Now would be a paltry sum. Doing clinical trials, getting great results, going back to the FDA, only to have them say, well, we think we'd like you to do one more larger study that'll take 2 years, and cost you another $40 million or whatever. And then you'd look at them and you'd say, so if we did that and we got the same kind of results we got in the first 3, are you going to approve us? And they'd say, well, nope, we can't commit to that, right? So you're going back to investors and you're saying, well, we want to raise a bunch more money. We want to do something else that we can't determine when or if the FDA will ever approve this. And so I learned at that point, from my perspective, that's not what I want to do. Right. So, if you're building a robotic surgical device, you got to go through all of that, and there's a lot of things that are great about the miracles of modern medicine. When my daughter went in and had her liver transplant, and that was amazing. These surgeons spent 12 hours doing her. They had done one before her back to back, and they did one afterwards. So their surgical teams worked like 36 hours, straight doing surgery like that. And for a lot of things, that's necessary. But at that point, I decided that I'm going to figure out a better way to help people and go to market where I can rapidly iterate to fix things. Because, I'll give you an example. Back then, the FDA, if you had a device that had software in it, and our device had software, it had done some of the first medical or microprocessors that we were using. We had to do a lot of the programming and assembly language in order to make them fit in the memory that was available. So that's how long ago this was. But so you couldn't even iterate on the software because you had to submit for their approval the software every time, right? Because they wanted to control it. You can't do that now, right? You can't use artificial intelligence in that way because we don't even know why it makes some of the decisions it makes, much less convince the FDA that it made an intelligent choice. So all of those things, and then just for the hardware side of it, I recognize the supply chain of getting all of the parts, all the manufacturing, getting all the assembly done, putting it in a warehouse so that you could distribute it, having repair centers. And, at that time, if you wanted to go launch the product in France, you had to go over to France. You had to set up a company in France, a French company in SA. You had to get an office, hire people, hire accountants, file taxes. You had to do all these things and make commitments to them about, how you were going to manage and distribute the product there. It was just so hard. Today, doing software, especially an app, you can release it to 192 countries, in 10 minutes, right? And they collect the money and they give you a single check that's got all the currency conversion and whatever. And so to me, it became very obvious that software without a supply chain of hardware was by far the best way to go do something, which is what I've been doing since about the year 2000, is only software companies, only companies that avoid the FDA, and only companies that don't have moving hardware products that I have to do all those other things with. A lot of those are great and they help us, in all of our, health wearables and whatever, this is amazing stuff and it's going to make a big difference. But that's the kind of game that an Apple needs to play, right? Or a Medtronics or somebody like that. That's not the kind of game that I think a startup like myself with my limited ADD, is wise at doing.
Hmm. Well, I think it's good to know yourself, right? But additionally, as you mentioned, right, founding and, selling companies and going through those cycles means, facing tough pivots and long and slow, regulatory cycles. And so what's your advice for entrepreneurs who feel discouraged by all of this, by the approvals, delays, setbacks, everything that goes into it?
Well, you got to start with passion, right? You gotta want to do something that is important, right? If it's not important, you're not gonna get through it. Now, that important can be, I just want to make as much money as possible. I want to be Mark Zuckerberg, and have my yacht and islands and all that kind of stuff. That's not my motive. Right, at all. Money doesn't buy me happiness at all. But first of all, you got to have the passion. Second of all, you got to be reasonably naive. And I mean that because after every one that I sell or exit from and turn over to somebody else, and I've done that on a major scale at least 6 times. There's a rock in the mountains here by a big reservoir, and I go sit on that rock and I say, okay, what would I do different? And would I do that again if I know what I know now? Right. And it's about 50-50. About half of them I wouldn't do again just because they were too hard relative to the end reward for the people we were targeting. It's the naivety afterwards. And every time you do this, the world has changed and it's different and you got to solve new problems. And so if you don't like solving problems, if you're not passionate about it, if you can't work through with grit, the problems you'll face, raising money, building the product, getting it tested, solving it, etc. I'm a big advocate of Angela Duckworth from University of Pennsylvania. She's a psychologist that wrote a book called Grit. And you may be familiar with it, but she basically did some really great research to show it's not the smartest people, it's not the most knowledgeable people that are successful. The people that are successful have 3 characteristics. They're conscientious about what they're doing. They want it to be great. They're resilient. They have grit, meaning, that they'll last a long time. And then there's the resilience, right? Because you will hit obstacles every time. And if you can't bounce back and say, okay, that was stupid, I can't tell you, there's not maybe a day, but there's certainly not a week that doesn't go by where I look at something that we've decided as a team and say, wow, that was kind of stupid now that we know what we know. But you didn't know it ahead of time. And if you let that bother you, you're going to be in trouble, right? You just have to say, I got to commit myself to this and I'm going to figure out how to solve the problems. And so those are the things that we do for founding companies. And I keep doing it because we keep solving the problems.
FoodKey is designed to simplify diabetes and metabolic health, particularly, making nutrition guidance accessible, affordable, and as well culturally intelligent. And so what gap did you see in current solutions, and how does your technology make healthy choices easier, especially for, diverse users that come from different backgrounds and experiences?
If you take just the diabetes angle, so, FoodKey can be used for weight loss, diabetes, cardiovascular, hypertension, et cetera. Slightly different library for optimal effectiveness, but the product, the way it looks to the people using it is exactly the same. But all of the current solutions, from there's a number of companies that are diabetes care companies that's all they do, like Virta Health and Glucoa and Omada Health and whatever. But they're all big organizations. They have big teams. They do big interventions with you. They're expensive. They require lots of time on your part. You have to learn lots of stuff about diet. You have to get your mini degree as a registered dietitian, and they take lots of mental effort every day. And the most important is they don't last. None of them last long term, because as soon as you don't have that team around you talking to you and encouraging you, which you can't unless you're going to spend thousands of dollars a month, you're going to revert. 90% of the people revert, just like weight loss reverts. So we saw those as the problems. And so we said, it's got to be simple. It's got to be inexpensive. It's got to be comprehensive for nutrition in a way that people don't have to go read books on nutrition, plan meals in detail, track calories on sheets or in apps where that's all they do. So we looked at and we made check marks by every one of those problems that were barriers to people being a easier solution. You can't solve the motivation problem, right? Some people are not motivated to fix it. They want to go in and get a pill for it, right? And guess what? Your physician will give you lots of pills, right? Of all the 8 syndromes that come out of what's called metabolic syndrome, which is what happens when you have poor nutrition, excess calories, and low exercise, right? You develop a whole bunch of things that they give you pills for to treat the symptoms, but don't treat the disease, right? So your lipids are going to be high, so they're going to give you statins, right? And you're going to be hypertensive, so they're going to give you channel blockers, and you're going to be overweight, so they're going to give you GLP-1s, and there's a host of those problems. And so it's not atypical for people to be on 4 or 5 medications that are all targeting just the symptoms and not the cause of the problem. We, decided to go after the cause of the problem, and so that's where we fit our niche in there. And we're having great success and results now. Don't think we've hit the inflection point yet, because you got to break through with the population, and we're in the middle of a big clinical trial that we're doing under an IRB, and we've got great results from the pilot studies and that, and we've got 6,000 or so people that are using it, but it's going to explode into the millions. There are 38 million people just with diabetes type 2, not including the 95 million that are pre-diabetic, and that's not cardiovascular and all the others. So the market's huge. We're going to get there, and people can do this from their phone, and it will cost them nothing. It will be free. And it is now. You can use it today for other reasons.
You've built close-knit multidisciplinary teams across, several startups, including, partnerships with experts in AI and machine learning. And so what have you learned about what makes technical and creative teams work really well together, especially over, multiple ventures?
We have an interesting structure that I don't know that anybody else has done. So in the last 2 startups we've done, everybody on the founding team got equal equity, right? Including me. So everybody, we split the company up, and, like the current company has 6 founders, and, all 6 founders own exactly the same equity. And our governance rules for us as a public beneficial corporation are that the 6 founders are the board, and we vote on all major business and technology and medical decisions. And the majority rules. I'm the tiebreaker if there's an even number. So people come into it saying, look, every one of us has just as much to stake. And, I learned this with one of our, he's just a consultant on this. His name is Dr. Lucilia. He was one of the creators of Siri at Apple, and ran Siri, and ran the All of Innovation for Samsung, and whatever. He's writing books and stuff back in France now, big AI expert. But he and one of our companies said, today, the idea may come from me, and so I'm more valuable today, but tomorrow, you're going to figure out the business model, and you're going to be more important than I am once we get to that point. And then when we get to the marketing point and the distribution team, without them, we're going to fail just for different reasons. And so, he convinced me, and so we've implemented it. So everybody on the team has the same equity and is involved in the decisions, and they have ownership. Now, beyond that, you got to have trust and fairness for everybody, and that's part of the way we structured it, so that it's, it's fair, and everybody's got to get along. We vote people off the island that we call prickly. That's the word we use inside. And we've hired people, and we have consultants and other, the people that we use. And sometimes we bring people into the team. But if they're prickly and don't get along, and, don't take criticism and don't perform well, then, we get rid of them. So we keep great people around that get along. So the team loves working together. And I will tell you that when you find great people, there is a massive difference between people that are really good at something and the average person. So take just software programmers, right? I found that the difference between a great software engineer and an average software engineer is probably more than 100x in terms of everything they do, the way they document the code, the way it's architected, the way it's supportable, and the way its efficiency and speed. You can build a really junky car, but the difference between that and something that's really reliable and sleek, and that is a big difference. And so by giving everybody equity, and they cash out of the last company, and they all leave at different points depending on what they're doing and what they're interested in. But then we all seem to catch back up with each other and say, okay, who's got new ideas, and we talk about the ideas. We come up with some, we build a prototype, right? We assess it quickly in its smallest, crudest way. And we've even developed our own way of determining whether something can be viral or not. We build a minimum viable product. We find a group of demographic that is the people we're going after. We give it to them, right? We give it to them for like, anywhere from 2 weeks to 8 weeks. And then we ask them, how disappointed would you be if we took this away? And if 40% or more of them say, I'd be very disappointed, we have a hit. And then we can go from there. So we can even test it early. And when I talk about those other products that didn't make it, there are various things that happened in those kind of testings that where we said, we got a better idea. In some cases, it's just a better idea, right? If you want to put all your wood behind one arrow, you might pick that other product, even though you have some of them. And we come back to them. There's one that's been on our list for a while now that we filed some patents on. After this one is done, if it's ever done in 10 years, we'll go back and do ones that we have on our list. They'll have to be updated and changed, but there's so many things that need to be fixed and can be fixed and that don't work well that the opportunities are endless for entrepreneurs.
So switch gears a bit. After 9 years in a large company, right, as you spoke about previously, you returned to entrepreneurship, right? And so from your perspective, what can large organizations learn from startups and vice versa about really driving, real innovation in healthcare?
Yeah. I guess this hit me when I spent 9 years at Cadence, right, in various roles and that it is very difficult to truly innovate inside a big company. And that's because, the larger it gets, the more it regresses to the mean in terms of the average person, right? And the average person at a big company is more interested in, I want to get my work done. I may want to do a good job, but then I want to go home to my family and do other stuff. Right. And people, it's hard to get people to change and think differently, right? They want to get into a routine and just do stuff. So, inside a big company, you go to meeting after meeting and you could have the most brilliant idea, in the world. But if it's really brilliant, people are not going to see it because it's not what's there today. You go in and you propose something. And people, will have 100 reasons why you don't know about this. You can't solve this problem yet. You haven't figured out how to do this. We don't know how we're going to price it. We don't know what it's going to do to our current generation of products. There are so many naysayers in that. When I was at Cadence, we had a great CEO. His name was Joe Costello. He was CEO of the year, I think, with one of the business magazines, and that he built Cadence into multi-billion-dollar company from nothing really, and used by NVIDIA for all their $4 trillion worth of market valuation today. They use Cadence software to design their chips and whatever, but we tried multiple efforts inside to have teams innovate, to put teams aside. We even took basements and put teams there for new endeavors and told them they didn't have to talk to management or marketing or go to meetings, just innovate. And the two that were successful both left and spun off and built those technologies separately on their own and made lots of money. So, but I remember one time sitting with Joe Costello and he said, I can try to spawn 10 different innovations inside our company, and one of them will be successful, and it'll be a hell of a fight. He says, or I can let the market entrepreneurs out there design great new products, and as soon as I see them, I don't have a problem going back to the board and saying, I want to spend $100 million on these guys because they solved the problem. And so, it became very obvious to me that you can solve problems and you can do things that you don't have to convince 50 average people that this is a great idea. Whenever you start these ideas, there are so many unknowns. You got a gut instinct. You got a feeling for AI and machine learning and software and cloud, SaaS technology and the medical side of the problem and, how you can help it. You got an intuition where all these pieces come together in some kind of solution, but you can't it's not fully envisioned in your mind, and you don't know what you're going to run into until you actually build something and get it out there and get feedback. And so I decided that I love to innovate and I love to create things, and I don't love to sit in meetings, and I don't love to spend all my time convincing people that there's something here, we'll solve it. And if we don't solve it, it's not a negative on our career. It is in big companies sometimes. It's okay. We learned something that we didn't know before. We can apply that in the future. Let's go.
Many innovators struggle with scaling business models in health tech, especially with, complexity in regulatory processes or, operational complexities as well. And this also ties into slow adoption. And so what hard lessons have you learned about breaking through these barriers to achieve impact?
I think that it starts up front, picking the right entry points, right? So, if I've got an idea for some new material for a heart valve, right, that's going to be a long road. right? I mean, taking the materials, forming, getting the prototypes, testing them in animal models, testing them in other biologic fluids to see how long they're going to last, getting them implanted the first time with FDA, regulatory oversight and whatever. That's going to be difficult. And, if you watch the history of pharmaceuticals and medical implants, for example, the materials and the substances that looked great in the short term because they're all built around randomized controlled trials. Everybody thinks that RCTs are the gold standard, for doing trials. Well, RCTs are really only good for doing short-term interventions with simple outcomes. And so, I can show you that your lipids will be better off by taking this new statin that I just invented, in the course of the 5 years that I developed it and tested it. That's how long that will take, maybe 10. But guess what? There's a huge chance that we'll find that there's other untoward effects on the rest of your physiology that happen later, in different ways that we can't even anticipate because we can't test it that long. And we're sort of into that right now in our nutrition space. You can't do a study that will test whether what we're doing, you're going to be better off, 60 years from now, because you can't run that as a controlled trial. You can't get, I can't eat bad food every day all the time for the next 60 years and then ask you to eat only food we think is healthy, right? So we had to go a completely different approach. But all I'm saying is that you got to pick the entry point and you got to have a thesis to start with on how you're going to get traction, in that particular market. And then you got to test it early, right? Because if you don't test it early, you're going to spend a lot of money. And, we've learned that we either fund it ourselves from the team or we find angels that are in sympathy with what we're trying to do because they have family members or whatever. And we keep the spend very low until we are really confident that it's going to be wildly successful. And then we go raise a lot of money if we have to. Oftentimes we don't have to. Software is, our current product costs us a couple pennies per user per month to deploy it completely for all the costs associated with it. When competitors trying to deliver diabetes solutions are charging thousands to Medicare for what they deliver and making you go to class for 72 hours and you have to become a mini RD and then every food has to be planned, it's not the right approach. It will never work. And statistically, we've shown that. So I think, picking the right entry point, having a thesis on how you're going to get your early market, entrance in there, and then, test it early is how I look at every one of these markets. And we throw ideas left and right over our shoulders because we can't figure out how to do some of those before we even start building.
I know you focused on clinical decision support to avoid regulatory bottlenecks and speed market entry. And so, what advice do you have for founders designing products that empower patients or clinicians while minimizing that red tape?
We have quite a diverse group. Head creative at Stars Encore, for 20 years now, he's our chief creative, so people come from different backgrounds, our AI, machine learning and data science, people started out, they have PhDs in laser physics and other things that are different fields, right? So you pick people that, are smart, and so we research everything, so a big part, almost 6 months of designing our current product was spent saying, okay, the biggest challenge from out from the beginning is going to be behavior change, right? How do you get people to change their behavior? And so, we spent a bunch of time, looking into Daniel Kahneman's work on, he's a behavioral economist, Nobel Prize winner, that worked around Thinking Fast and Slow is his book with Amos Tversky. And then Richard Thaler for Nudge. He's also a behavioral economist, Nobel Prize winner. Lots of great ideas and experiments and research on how to change behavior. But interestingly enough, the one we employed most, and it's all over our product, is BJ Fogg from Stanford. He's a psychologist there. His book is called Tiny Habits. And he's been doing seminars and coaching people for habit change for a couple decades now. And, his results are so amazing and so simple and so easy to get into. Everything about our FoodKey product, incorporates what we learned about making it simple and rewarding from the beginning. Otherwise, people don't change behavior.
But behavior change is quite difficult, whether for clinicians or patients. And so, what principles of simplicity, feedback, and incentive have you really found maybe to be the most effective in getting those lasting results?
I'll start from the top again. Simplicity, right? If it's not simple, you're cutting off 90% of the market, probably more than that to begin with. So simple, what's the definition? Depends on what it is. But, for ours is you download the product, you open it up, you take a picture of your food, and it tells you whether that food's good or bad for you. Right? That's as simple as you can be. And then it keeps track of that over time. And then it's got to be rewarding, meaning you got to see results pretty quickly from doing it or learn something new. So, every time with ours that you take a picture of your food or drink, it's going to tell you in some level of really interesting detail whether that's good or bad for you. But we do it with a single score. We call it the FoodKey score. And that's a much longer conversation. But so it's got to be simple. It's simple and rewarding. And then you got to give people nudges at exactly the time when they can act on them and they're actionable and they're reasonable. You can't just give people a bunch of lessons and say, here's a list of things that are do's and here's a list of things that are don't. People don't work that way, right? You got to be able to give them the information. So all those things that BJ Fogg tells you in his Tiny Habits book, we built into it where people can do it and they can start exactly where they are and they don't have to go to some extensive, aggressive, whole plant food-based diet with no alcohol and no oils and whatever. Dean Ornish's stuff is very effective at reversing your cardiovascular disease and your diabetes, but it's 72 hours of class. It's $10,000, right? And it's just, people aren't going to do that. People don't spend that amount of time. And so it's got to be something much, much cheaper and easier and simple. So simplicity with behavior is really the answer there, with prompts that are directed at exactly what they're doing, that they can act on before they actually enact the behavior.
Your current work, leverages cloud technology, image recognition, and continuous feedback for global scalability. And so what are the opportunities and risks in bringing health innovation to a worldwide audience today?
Well, first of all, one of the questions is, do you need to go international? Right. So certainly you can distribute our product that way. And because of the ubiquity of English across the planet, you could use it in its English form today. But, really there's cultural differences in all the different geographies, right? So I've done products, really around the world in 190 countries in various ways. The cultural differences are the biggest ones. And it's amazing how silly little things, and the words you use can make a difference. So we always have to team internationally with somebody that understands the problem and the technology and hopefully has some kind of distribution channel internationally to give it a kickstart. Right. And so my opinion is, joint ventures or associations of some kind are almost always the best because in our case, for example, we've got a custom massive food library that we use to give you that information that I talked about. But there are different foods and they use different words and names and ingredients in different dishes, in different countries. So, do you have 98% of the foods that people are going to be scanning in our library with all of the nutritional decompositions that are required? Because, ours is not we'll show you how many calories are in that. Calorie counting doesn't work. We have a book coming out in December that's called Healthy Enough. Every attempt to calorie count or deprivation as a means of trying to get to these ends has failed over 50 years, every single one of them. Even the GLP-1s that are highly effective to get you kick-started in losing weight and making those conditions better that are based on how much, subcutaneous adipose there is and whatever, but they don't work long-term because your hypothalamus is indefeatable, right? It's going to tell you that it's hungry and it wants that stuff, and it's going to tell you every time you eat and every time you're out with friends. And humans, are so good at fooling ourselves. Well, I had spinach yesterday for lunch, so I'm going to have pizza today because I was good yesterday. We can show you with your scores in FoodKey, exactly where you are on whether you're not going to develop those diseases and whether you're going to reverse them, versus you're going to be in trouble, here by the time you're 40 or 50 years old. And so, so you don't have to do, like I said, software is my choice because I don't have to have all those other things. Yeah, you're going to have to pay local local taxes now. But but I think you team with somebody that knows that market, and several times before we bought those teams, then after that, and brought them in, and they benefited from it. So that's I think nobody understands those markets well enough to do the kind of things we're doing and just say, oh, here's our product that's working in the U.S. Go ahead and do it there. Now, I will say, if you've got 95 million pre-diabetics and the number one cause is cardiovascular disease for death, and it's completely reversible, et cetera, do we need to have a company that is worth billions and IPO worthy? Do we need to even go outside the United States, given the size of the problem? No, we probably will, and we'll partner to do that because we won't have enough bandwidth early on to do that. So we'll get somebody else to help us because this is a huge problem worldwide. We've exported the Western diet, and now everybody. I spend part of the year on the Nagoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, which is one of the blue zones. But I can tell you that when you go to Tamarindo, a vacation town for American tourists, the people are just as overweight as we are. It's only when you get outside the city and into the rural areas where people are really healthy, and they're one of the blue zones. And so we can do it to anybody. And so that's our philosophy on international. It'll happen when it happens. More often in the last couple of companies, people have come to us and said, we want that now. We launched English as a second language product that was meant for the U.S. and students, and then did it in Europe and stuff. And we ended up selling it to a Chinese company because they came to us and said, we want to use this in all of our classes, and we're going to distribute it to tens to hundreds of millions of people through our channel. And that was the right thing. So whenever we exit one of our technologies or our companies, the first thing we ask is are you going to help us accomplish our mission, or are you just going to tear it down, take it, hide it, tear it apart, whatever? If they can't answer how they're going to improve upon it and distribute it wider, then we don't even get to the how much money are you willing to pay us discussion. It's always got to be that, first.
Well, my last question for you before diving into the lightning round is, looking ahead, what trends or breakthroughs in digital health, nutrition, or AI excite you the most? And what would you tell a new founder to really focus on?
I've worked with enough teams and enough thousands of different people, right, that there's a kind of personality that can identify problems, right? Seeks problems out, right? And, if you're not somebody that drives around in your car and doesn't say, man, I could fix that light so I'm not sitting here in the middle of the night waiting at a red light, when there's nobody coming, I can see in all directions. If you're not the kind of person that's thinking, that there's problems around you that you could solve if you chose to go after it, right? Then I'm not sure you're an entrepreneur, right? You could be part of the team of entrepreneurs, but not maybe the seed. So the first thing is, find the problem, but then, go to the root of the problem. You got to say, what's actually causing this? There are so many companies out there right now that are, for example, exploiting the crazy billing system, on how you bill insurance companies and Medicare, and how you have to have a certain diagnostic code and a certain CPT set of codes in order to get paid back a certain amount of money. There are all kinds of companies that are exploiting all of that craziness in our healthcare system, and they're making good money and stuff, right? And they make more money for their clients, but they're not doing anything but making the whole system more messed up than it was before. Our system is the middlemen make so much money in our healthcare system. It's not the doctors, it's not the patients that are gaining, largely from it. We have some miracles of medicine. My daughter's one of them that are amazing, right? But the vast majority of these people walking around with diabetes type 2 and erectile dysfunction and breast cancer and that are all largely related to your lifestyle and your nutrition and your calories. You got to say, what's the root problem for what they have, and then I think, this is my prejudice, right? And I love anybody that takes on a hard problem and breaks through and solves it. But, I love wearables and other things because it's so obvious to me, and there's so much good data and research showing that our lifestyle is the biggest problem with our health by far of anything anybody can do. We used to think of, I just got diabetes from my genetics, or, I just got bad genetics from my father because my father and grandfather and grandmother died of heart attacks, which they did. No, right? I have great lipids, right? And all I do is use my FoodKey product, right? And I scan all my food and I make trade-offs sometimes and I keep my score above 70. And you ought to see, I went from 188 pounds to 160 now without any deprivation over the course of 6 months at all. I'm fulfilled. I love the food I eat. I've changed my diet, and we're not strict, right? It's not a vegan diet. You can eat potato chips all day long and have a horrible health problems from being a vegan, right? Just because you're a vegan doesn't mean that you're eating good food. Life is celebration and food is celebration. Part of our approach from the behavioral standpoint is let's start where you are and let's give you little tiny steps, DJ Fogg stuff, to getting better and better and better over a period of time as you adapt your tastes and what you buy at the store and what you feed yourself, and you'll get better and better. And that's something you can maintain for a lifetime rather than severe deprivation, great results really quickly, and within a year you're back to the same weight. The Biggest Loser show on TV, right? You've seen that they went and interviewed the winners, right? And the winners, 3 years later are as big as they were before they started the program. And it's true for every one of the people on the program. That's exactly what we're going through. You got to do something different. I'm a little bit off your question, but it's find a real problem, find the first principle cause of that problem, figure out how you can use diverse technology. With AI now, we are in a world where asking the right question is way more important than actually having the knowledge, right? It gives you answers to stuff that, I ask it questions in chemistry, and software and machine learning, and that every single day that gives me answers on things that would have just, it would have been impossible for me to know. And so, yeah, you need deep experts, but you can go find deep experts, anywhere. They can be machine learning experts or AI prompt experts or whatever. You can find those people, but you could find so much of it now to decide. And you can ask, some of the AI models. Here's a problem I'm looking at. I'm thinking about this as a solution. What are all the barriers? It's amazing. That would have taken me a year's worth of talking to people and going out and meeting people. And I can get the answers back in a matter of minutes, right now. So, find the problem, go to the root of the problem, figure out how you'd apply diverse technology to it, then say, what's the business model that I can apply to this? Can I make a good business model out of this? How am I going to get adoption, and any kind of viral uptake if that's what it requires? And there's ways to test all that. How can I build a minimal viable product? And so just walk down that and things will fall off that list, but you'll end up with something that you go, oh my gosh, I can go after that. And, if you think that other people have solved it, just go do some AI searches on what other people are doing and figure out whether you got a unique angle on it, because I can guarantee innovation is going to be exploding because of AI and machine learning and neural nets and all that kind of stuff. We'll be using that more. We use it heavily in our product now. I mean, just the recognition piece, in our product, where you take a picture of your food. We actually, in a previous effort that died, we actually built carousels that had you put your phone in and took high resolution images of a food plate turning around while that arm went up and down, and took thousands of high resolution pictures, starting to train it. And then all of a sudden we figured out, wow, we can go out and build a neural net, and we can go on the web and we can find 5 billion image text pairs and do the machine learning with the neural net so that we can identify the food. Now, it's not perfect because you can take a picture of a burrito, and if you as a human can't figure out what's inside that burrito, you can't, our machine doesn't have x-ray vision, right? So it's never perfect, but it's about 80 or 85%. And the rest of the things we built in there to make it really easy for you to keep track of your food without you doing anything, way less than 5 minutes a day. I track all the food that I eat. I probably spend maybe 90 seconds total per day to do that. And it tells me exactly what my future is going to be for chronic conditions. And, your lifestyle has most of the effect on how long you're going to live and how healthy you're going to be up until your mid 90s, right? Then genes start taking over. But up until then, it's mostly what you can do.
Well, I love that. And I think a lot of people need to build, right, to improve the system, not just to add on to it. And so that's everything that I'm taking from what you said. So let's dive into the lightning round. And my first question for you is, what's the biggest technical or regulatory myth you still see holding back health innovation?
It's our insurance system here, right? It's the billing reimbursement, system. You can say all you want about Canada, UK, and their single payer systems and that, yeah. And if I have the worst disease in the world, do I want to be treated here in America, right? But if I've got regular stuff that I'm dealing with, right, a single payer system. So I think that trying to kill the Affordable Care Act and whatever is just stupid. But anyway, I would say that the biggest problem right now is that billing system, the CPT coding system, the insurance managed assembly line. If I knew how to solve that, maybe I pass my current product on. But that's just too big of a ball of yarn for me to try to untangle, given the way it is right now, and given how many people are making billions of dollars off of the system, as screwed up as it is. Yeah, just defeating the people that are making money becomes a nightmare.
My next question for you is, in one sentence, what's the most surprising lesson you've learned about building for behavioral change in healthcare?
Simple and rewarding. It has to be simple and rewarding to start. Otherwise, it'll be, if ever, it'll be a Sisyphus, push the rock up the hill, try to solve the problem continually forever. Simple and rewarding.
And my last question for you is, what gets you most energized about launching new ventures, even after being so many years in the healthcare field?
Well, it started when I was 10 or below. I love building things, right? Number one. I love seeing problems and then applying lots of different pieces of technology to the solution. And today there's a book called Range, which talks about the value of having a multidisciplinary person or team that has a lot of knowledge across lots of different fields, right? But is not deep in any of them, right? Especially with AI, right? If you know just enough about chemistry and medicine and physiology and machine learning and AI and neural nets, software and SaaS, if you know just enough about all those things to say, oh, I completely see how all these are going to come together to be some kind of interesting solution for me. And so it's I love building things, and what keeps you passionate is there a social good to it, right? I mean, if you're doing something just to make money, great. It drives me nuts when I go to the National Conference on Nutrition in the United States, and the two main sponsors are Pepsi and Coca-Cola. Right. I mean, if you look at our scoring system for our application that goes from 1 to 100, 100 being great, 1 being the worst thing you can eat, Coke and Pepsis and sugar sweetened beverages are a 1 on that scale. There is no nutrition in them. There's just sugar, and it wrecks the body. And so do something that's socially good, and then apply interesting technology that you can find, and you can find the experts as long as you have the idea and the grit and the resilience to go do it.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time and insights today. Based on everything that we discussed, are there any final thoughts that you have for the audience?
No, I think more people should be watching your show, though. Until you contacted me, I was not aware, and then I've been watching your episodes and that. So good job. So I hope it's out there. We may even make a book or something so that we can get some traffic back to you.
Thank you. Very much appreciated. For that and everything that you've talked about, again, thank you for your time. And where can people choose to, connect with you if they choose to do so?
Yeah. So I'll just give out my, one of my public emails, which is Jim B at FoodKey.org. You can get a hold of me there, or you can go to our FoodKey.org site, and people can use the product while we're going through our next clinical trial. Now, the product they can use is at diabetes-cure.org, and they can actually use the application for free there and try it out. And even though that's diabetes, you'll see versions of it that are coming out for weight, cardiovascular disease, and a bunch of other conditions also. And our goal with the whole company is we want the government to pass this out for free to citizens everywhere, because it's so inexpensive to manage, and it will teach you without knowing anything ahead of time, about the nutrition that's going to cause you problems later. And if you want to live a long, healthy life, you do this, you'll change your lifestyle slowly, and you can maintain it for the rest of your life. And we expect to give it to everybody for free.
Well, amazing. Jim, thank you for your time on the K in Clarity podcast.